Disney Mesop, the Executive Director of Can International. We have Hilda Nakabuya from Uganda, founder of Fridays for Future Uganda, and an environmental and climate activist by heart. We have Daniela Villar. Thank you for coming. The Minister of Environment of the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And we have Mohamed Adau. He's the founder and director of PowerShift Africa. We're still missing one panelist, Elisa Morgan. She will arrive and then can join. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, and also a professor. Oh, oh, yeah. So we have a full panel now. So first, before we give the word to our panel who will speak about the just transition, we also have Matteo. He's the Oxfam researcher and also the lead author of the report that Oxfam wrote on unjust transition. And he will give a really short 3-minute presentation laying the ground for our conversation today on this panel. I'm going to give this one to you.
Thank you everyone for the patience. Here we are. So very quickly I'm going to present. Can you hear me all right? Perfect. So no worries. But use this in case you want to. So I'm going to talk about very shortly about the unjust transition report we produced. It has a very short key argument, and is that the world is standing at a crossroads, and we have just two options ahead of us: climate colonialism, when the transition is continuing the current path that is reproducing colonial dynamics and deepening inequalities, or we have the alternative, that is just transition. It could serve as a transformative opportunity to address the inequalities that actually underpin structurally the climate crisis. So this is how option number one is looking. Option number one is repeating the past. Repeating the past because this is the same that happened during the fossil fuel era. So it's an unjust, colonial, and extractive transition that is being built on those foundations of inequality among countries, so between the North and the Global South, divide, but also within countries, because we see big differences among the top 1, top 10% of consumers, emitters, and the rest of the population. And two dynamics stand out in our report. One is the race for the transition minerals. And we must say that 70% of the transition minerals are located in the Global South. So this means that the extraction is happening mainly in the Global South, and is happening in the same terms that natural resources have been extracted for centuries. So we are just repeating that same dynamics. But the second one, that can be a different type of extraction, is on finance. So we have a skewed financial economic architecture. The renewable energy investment is also concentrated in the global north rather than in the global south. So we know that 49% of renewable energy investment last year was concentrated in the global north countries, while 29% was in China, and then we only had 2 or 1% for Latin America, the Middle East region, or Africa, or Asia. So what is the alternative that we have? Is to decolonize our energy future for a more fast, fair, funded, and feminist transition that is actually for all and not just for the few. So we think that this is following 500 years of resistance to colonialism, communities, workers, governments are advancing a more just approaches based on those 500 years of resistance towards extractions, defending the people and the planet, defending from land grabs and so on, but also reclaiming control and sovereignty over their own resources and building energy systems that prioritize public good over private profit. So what we found in our report is that actually there is no single footprint for a just transition, but we at least must share one principle that it must ground the transition. That is, energy should serve life, not profit. Next one. So, finally, I will address some of the recommendations for a just energy transition that we think are very important to address the climate colonialism that we are seeing right now. So, we need differentiated transitions globally based on different responsibilities and capabilities. We need to address overconsumption, mostly in the global north countries, but also in the top 1 and top 10% of the population that are driving global emissions. But we also need to transform trade and investment frameworks because they favor also the few, and reform the tax systems so that we have also the money to invest in the public system and the energy. End the extractive finance and prioritize public investment again, and end extractive practices that ensure free, prior, and informed consultation with communities. Then we have the democratization and ownership of energy and the governance. So again, sovereignty over the energy by the people, by communities. And lastly, but not least, the most important part that we think is that we should embed justice at all policy levels. And why this is important, we are here at COP30 because we are talking about the Belém Action Mechanism for a global just transition. So this is a pivotal moment for adoption an international mechanism. We have just seen outside in the meeting rooms that most of the countries, G77 and a lot of the countries are actually supporting the creation of an international mechanism that can coordinate and give coherence to the just transition, give also some steering in knowledge sharing and generation, but also means of implementation, action and support. And this will lead us to protect the core justice principles, make the just transition more financeable, integrate just transition into national planning, and institutionalize participation and co-creation. So thank you so much. You will just see that under your seats, if you see it above them, you have some postcards that actually lead to the QR of the report. And now I will give the floor to the speakers.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, Matteo, for this presentation, and also for setting the scene for our panelists. So, Oxfam and Can International organized this panel together, and because of that reason, I wanted to give the floor first to both Amitabh and to Tasneem. Tasneem, I will give you a different microphone. To start off with your reflections on the just transition for everybody.
Thank you very much, Marita. Thank you and greetings to everybody. So, again, congratulations on the report. This is really a path-breaking report, identifying exactly the challenges that we all needing to grapple with in a world that is becoming more and more and more and more unjust on all fronts, not just climate injustice, but across the board injustices, social injustices, political injustices, wars, conflicts, genocide. So in a context like that, really a true and meaningful just transition is the one. Is there a problem? You're fine? Okay. Is the one thing that can give us hope, the approach that can give us hope. And I say this because, and I recognize that this presentation has been about the energy transition, but just transitions themselves have to be economy-wide and society-wide in its approach. And once you do that, you will also then need to recognize that to ensure justice, your planning processes related to just transitions has to be inclusive. You can only be just if you have in participatory and procedural justice. And that part of the just transition has to also be about distributive justice. The outcomes of these transitions have to be just for those that are, in fact, suffering all of these injustices, whether it's poverty, inequality, whether it's climate impacts and bearing the burdens of that, etc. So the entire comprehensive framework, if I can say that, and approach should be uh, um, implemented, and not in the way that everybody has a different definition of just transition right now. Fine. But what we have unfortunately done is made it into silos. There's an energy transition, then we might have an agriculture transition, as if in the real world these sectors are distinct from each other with no intersections. I mean, a transport transition. How do you do a transport transition when transport is a service, etc.? So I think the one big important message we would like to leave around just transition is that it has to be economy-wide, it has to be inclusive and society-wide, because the radical transformations we are going to require right now requires that kind of inclusivity, that we all co-own this transition, that all of us need to be at that table making the decision, workers, communities, indigenous peoples. The other thing I do want to say is that we've come into this space to fight for an outcome on the just transition, and not just another talk shop. We believe that the just transition outcome at this COP has to result in the adoption or agreement on an institutional arrangement of some kind that can be the international cooperation support piece for implementation of just transitions at national and local level. We think, as I think you said, Marita, there's been a bit of movement just now. We believe that, after all of the work we've collectively done, let's hope, but we still need work to do. We need you to go to the EU especially and go and bang on the door, get an agreement, because we need to send a signal of hope that governments, that all of us have used this process to signal that we're on a path towards justice. So thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks so very much, Tasneem. Amitabh, your reflections on the just transition, not only the energy transition, because I know you have them. Thank you, Amita. Um, Hilda, you have been given a really important voice to all the youth looking forward to what is coming and already really being very clear that things need to happen. So, what is your reflection? Closer. Okay. Apologies. We will try again. We have so many people in the panel that I couldn't sit on the. That's totally fine, but I'm struggling a little bit with something here and something here. Again, Hilda, you've been a voice for youth for already quite some time, from a young age. Can you guys hear me? Okay, I have to put it like here. Okay, I will. Again, Hilda, as the voice of the youth, what is it, your reflections on the just transition, including the energy transition? And I'm sure that you also will talk about more than just the energy transition. Thank you, Hilda, for your very, very, very clear appeal to what should happen here and the need for action, which Tasneem already described as the need for hope. Elisa, can I ask you to reflect from your perspective the work that you've been doing on the trust transition? Yes, there it is. Thanks so very much, Elisa. Mohammed. Ah, that's where the third microphone was. I was looking for it. Mohammed, from you've been already leading thinking and working on power shifts. That's why your organization is called Power Shifts. From your perspective, what needs to happen? What now needs to be addressed?
Before I talk about what needs to be addressed, I think it's important for us to recognize that our world faces numerous, intertwined existential crises across climate, food, energy, finance. But in this climate bubble, we come to think that the world faces a carbon dioxide molecule challenge rather than an all society challenge that is actually affecting the whole of society. And we tend to divide the world into developed and developing. When I want to argue that there isn't any single developed country, we're all in the quest of developing, and developing means delivering for people and for society across all issues. And this has now narrowed how we think of the challenges that the world is facing. And I want to invite you to depart from looking at the world using a carbon molecule lens and think of what people and society require. At the end of the day, what we want is better well-being, prosperity, and how do you deliver that? And so the more we think of a just transition, the more the industry that has caused the problem thinks of unjust extraction. And so you already create an opportunity for an equation that privileges the class that have actually emitted the bulk of the emissions that have caused climate change. If you think of it, we have a wealthy minority largely domiciled in the global north that accounts for 3/4 of the emissions that have caused climate change, when the rest of the world is still grappling with challenges. I come from Africa, so excuse me for using the Africa example. We're home to 18% of the global population. But you know what? We're only responsible for 0.5% of the historic emissions. But when you think of climate in this bubble, you hear Africa accounts for 4% of the global emissions. But when you actually factor cumulative emissions between the 18% of the global population that is domiciled in Africa, we've only contributed 0.5% of the historic emissions, effectively subsidizing the wealthy minority. And so what we call currently developed countries have largely developed on the back of Africa and the rest of the developing world. And so what I want you to think of is, how do we reset this conversation on terms that actually work for ordinary people, that enhances our well-being, that enhances our prosperity, and allows us to depart from extraction? Because what you call climate solutions, and I'm here thinking about the phasing out of fossil fuels and accelerating the deployment of renewables energy, is also going to be done on the back of poor people who don't even have the luxury of having access to energy. And I want you to think of how our society has been structured to be places where they extract raw materials cheaply so that they can meet their development objectives, where they actually structured our society to be a place where they can sell their finished product that includes transition minerals that have been drawn unjustly from those geographies, where they've structured our society to be the places where they will actually be able to draw cheap labor, and in some certain cases, those exotic destinations that they go to enjoy themselves. And a frame of a just transition has to be centered around people and around energy access. And we're talking about here democratic, people-centered energy solutions that are for them, not for extraction. And then the second thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is food. Our continent was, in the colonial days, a bread basket for the world. We didn't just produce for ourselves, we also exported. Today we're not net importers of food. And that didn't happen by accident. It was because they effectively undermined our food sovereignty. We've lost control of our seeds. so that we can actually lose the power to control what we eat. So the culturally appropriate, food that we've depended on is now seen as backward, and so we have to now all fight to import, food from other sources that undermines our sovereignty. The third thing I want to draw your attention to is on green industrialization. You all have heard of the talk about transition minerals. So every electric vehicle, every solar panel, every wind turbine now includes transition minerals that are largely mined from the global south. 70% of these minerals are in the global south. But what are they for? To help the global north decarbonize and sell the surplus to the global south in the name of climate solutions, rather than helping the global south aggregate their resources and industrialize so that we can be able to leapfrog and become a green leader and then sell the surplus. So the notion around transition is one that is driven by the privileged wealthy minority to safeguard their interest. And this inconvenient truth doesn't get talked about because we've narrowed the frame to think of a carbon dioxide molecule that needs to be cut. If you're in the global south, what have you got to cut? What have you got to cut? You have to develop, but develop in a climate compatible manner as you also help to address your food security challenge using indigenous seeds. Those opportunities have now been taken away from us. So I invite you colleagues, don't talk about just transition as an answer to unjust extraction. Think of it as a means to help deliver enhanced well-being and greater prosperity for the whole of society. And challenge this frame that has part of us as developing and others as developed. We should be in a quest to deliver people-centered prosperity on terms that are actually within the planetary limits.
Thank you so very much, Mohammed. And then last, but certainly not least, Minister Villar, Daniela, your reflections, but also you're from the government. And really from that perspective, from your province, what you can do would be really interesting to hear. Thank you so very much for your reflections. So, of course, we're always running out of time at these panels. What I want to ask all of the panel members is to use the final moments that we still have together for a one-way reflection on the following question. If there's one thing you would have to choose, either at the COP or outside the COP, what do you think would need to happen now to make progress? Because it's not only at the COP that progress is made, and it's not only on climate, we heard, that progress is made. So I want to give you all the floor for that 1 minute, and I will just start at the beginning with you, Elisa.
Thank you so much. I think I will just emphasize that idea of co-development, and maybe, for instance, moving away from technology transfer to also technology co-development. This is how we rework our innovation system and how we rework our economies as a whole. And so thinking about every hook we can find in the Just Transition work program, in all also forms of international cooperation that can support true co-development, not just among global north and global south governments, with human rights holders, with national and local authorities, and really seeing how we can support that driving from the bottom up, driving from across levels that doesn't accept a predetermined model of development.
Yeah, okay. So, thanks, Marita, and I'll say two things, but very briefly. I, I think we need to break this myth that we don't have finances. Make rich polluters pay. We need to tax the super rich. There are resources that we can easily access. It is a question of political will. And that is what we need at this juncture. And that will bring in climate finance. There are at the moment several initiatives, the UN Tax Convention, the G20 Stiglitz report. There is growing recognition that finances can be brought in for real people's issue. That's one. But the second, ultimately, we have chosen an economic system. It's a political choice. And this is not going to change through technocratic conversations. It is going to change through people's mobilization. So that's my second message. How do we bring together the climate struggles, the human rights struggles, the social justice struggles, the gender justice movement, all of these together to actually demand a different, a radically different, just economic system which brings us an equal future. Thank you.
Let's check. Yes? Okay, I think the COP must evolve into a platform, that not only sets the climate targets, but also enables the structural changes needed for a fair energy transition. We need governance spaces. We don't have, it seems like yes, but we don't have governance spaces that ensure equity, participation, and accountability in how transitions are financed and implemented. For our city, for our province, from Buenos Aires, Argentina, we believe that the Just Transition Work Program should deliver tangible outcomes at COP30, not only discussions. We need results. Governments should agree on clear guidelines for integrating social and economic justice into national transition plans, ensuring that no worker, community, or even region is left behind. That is what we need. So we ask you.
My recommendations, can you hear me? My recommendations would be to make rich polluters pay. The richest 1%, if taxed, can raise 2 billion euros. This money can be added to adaptation finance. We need adaptation finance to be tripled to be able to distribute these funds to people who are most affected by the climate crisis, and these resources should reach the communities that are affected in a people-centered way. That even for example, the women who are already bearing the brunt can receive these resources to be able to adapt to climate change, not as loans, but as grants. And we should stop the genocides that are happening around the world, the mass killings of people. This needs to be stopped. The greed-fueled war in Sudan should stop. In Gaza, in Congo, all this needs to be stopped. Thank you.
I think the time has come for us to formulate an alternative vision that allows us to address the intersecting crises of climate, energy, development, wars, genocide, finance, together at the same time. We need to get a huge sledgehammer and break the silos that has allowed us to be divided, where we think in very narrow terms of saving a panda, cutting a carbon dioxide molecule. You know, those things I think needs to end. We need to actually build on the rich history of collective action. I think the world has a rich history of actually working together. And from where I come from, we need endogenous ideas driving the change we want, rather than ideas that have actually been transferred to us. And I can't finish without saying it must begin by ending the genocide. There is no world in which we will ever have a just transition when we have a genocide. And if we end the genocide, the collective human spirit must actually allow us to work together to safeguard our collective, well-being. And I think that is the opportunity that we can work on. I had an unfortunate incident this week where I was told, working towards ending the genocide is not part of our mandate, that we're neutral. How can you be neutral in the face of a genocide? I think we must be honest and challenge ourselves. In which world can we save a planet that we can never be able to live in? And I think this is an opportunity for all of us to look inwards and ask ourselves these inconvenient truths, because if we fail to answer them honestly, we can never have a planet.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, this thing is quite weird. Yeah. So I want to support that one of the first things, well, one of the many things, but if we cannot, in our lifetime, under our watch, end the genocide, how are we thinking that we're going to save humanity from an existential crisis like climate change? And if we have lost our humanity and our morality to the extent that we couldn't care about some lives and only certain lives matter, why would we feel safe to put our fates in the hands of those who have been complicit in a genocide? That's the first message. Secondly, however, it is during this exact period of horror that all of the I don't want to use very strong adjectives. Yeah. But all of the honest face of empire has been shown. The system itself has been laid bare to us. It's been made visible. I mean, I usually refer to the whole analogy of the iron fist with a velvet glove. The velvet glove has been taken off, and all those pretenders of democracy, human rights champions, climate champions, all of that has been veiled as hypocritical. We are seeing this laid bare. And it is exactly the time when that is laid bare and it is in your face that people rise up. Because if you think about the streets in our world today, if you think about our streets in the world today, you will see that people have lost their patience with the system and the results of the system. And they're rising up. Whether that's been, and it's been the repression that comes with that as well has been devastating. But people are rising up. And so my other message is another message of hope. People's power will bring about change, and we need to help build the power of people. Thanks very much.
After these words, there's nothing left for me to say, which of course I then also will not do. Just to thank everybody on the panel for sharing with us, for giving your insights and your hope for the next steps in the future. Thank you all for coming. Just one final, if you want to see more of what it is that we're doing, just scan the codes and you will find more, including the work that Oxfam and CAN International and others have been doing together. So that's where you can find more information. Thank you all.